Welcome to the Perfect Place to Put a Practice podcast by Scott McDonald and DrDemographics.com, the best source of demographic, psychographic, and marketing information for professionals.
Hello, this is Scott McDonald of Dr. Demographics, and today I'm going to talk to you about, they had to go someplace realigning the population of America. Now, ultimately, I'm talking about the tide rolling in. And what that means is I've had conversations with other demographers. And those conversations have been, kind of head scratchers. People are trying to figure out what the relationship is between politics and demographics. Now, for example, the Republicans actually had about 3 million more voters, but they barely held on to the House of Representatives and lost the Senate. Or they came close to winning the Senate, but not quite enough. Now, what this really means is people are saying, well, somebody cheated, something was wrong. And I'm going to tell you what the demographers are saying. They are generally siding with the idea that, no, the election was not stolen, but that it happens occasionally that who wins in certain locations is more important than the raw number of votes. And so a lot of people are making assumptions about what happened, and they're getting it kind of wrong statistically. So I'm just going to say briefly, no, I think it was a fair election, and the Democrats did very well. But there's also a swinging thing that happens, that in some election cycles, things happen at such a way and in such numbers that it looks like it's not honest. And I think it is. What we're going to see is in the next election cycle, the pendulum swinging much more heavily toward the Republicans. Now, it's not just the political parties that I'm really dealing with. It is the demographics of various parts of the country that show some places are really growing and some places are really not. And the trends are that some places in the next election cycle are going to do very well for the Democrats, but mostly for the Republicans. And that's because of the pendulum swing that I'm referring to. Now, I want to talk to you just a little bit about what all this implies about not politics, but demographic trends that are happening. Now, when I say they had to go somewhere, there are a limited number of seats in the House of Representatives, which is a political manifestation. But it is also true that the demography is going through some shifts and people are not keeping up with it. Demographics are more solid and more predictable than opinion, and especially in a tight population where there's not one great number on one side of the equation versus the other. That's why I'm referring to it as the tide rolling in. Now, rather than stand still and hope for different outcomes, Americans are scratching their heads as they wait for the next shoe to drop. And it is going to drop. We know this because the elections are too narrow for them not to, but the long-term trends are really proving to be very, very definitive in time. I want to talk about that in this episode. The tide will roll in. Now, the midterm election was less a sign of long-term trends and the will of the people than it is a deep breath before the tide rolls in, before the trends become visible to all. It was a victory for no one, really, and a warning to all. Both sides of the political aisle should have taken messages, but I'm afraid people are saying, oh, we won, we're going to keep going with what we did. That's not a very wise idea. There are lessons to be learned, but they were overstated by almost everyone. And so part of my episode here is to provide a little warning that people who saw the results of this midterm election may have gotten very excited on one side of the equation or the other, but it's being overstated by a lot of people. Political power is not tied to geography. It is tied to demographics. In other words, it is not where something occurs, like California, New York, Illinois, but it's tied to the demographics that are often smaller than state boundaries. And that's important for you to know. Now, rather than stand still, it's going to change. I think it would be prudent for everyone to avoid making sweeping conclusions regarding the future of the entire nation as a whole. We know we're in recession right now. We know that there is also a large number of people who are moving from one place to another. A lot of people are assuming that this change in demographics is going to be heaviest in May and June of this year, of 2023. The states, particularly the mid-sized states, are going to play an increasingly important role in the future of the nation. New York, Illinois, and California are really still very large states, but they're fading in their impact as signposts of what's happening in the rest of the nation. And let me give you an example of how that's true. Politics of race and ethnicity really are declining in importance as segregation declines and intermarriage increases. Now, I want to bring up Angels City Study Club in Los Angeles. It was a study club for dentists, primarily, who are African American. And they were very strong, and one would assume powerful study club. But we noticed something when we started looking at the demography of these organizations. The Hispanic and Latino American Dental Association is a good contrast. And let me give you an example. 30 years ago, it was absolutely true that African American doctors were supporting each other and helping each other through sometimes difficult circumstances. The Hispanic population did the same thing. But these organizations are not as segregated as they used to be. So it happens that many practices will have mixed race doctors and is less dramatic than it used to be. Intermarriage has also had a big impact upon many people, husbands and wives of different racial groups, and this is happening so often that we're kind of assuming that, oh yeah, this particular ethnic or racial group is going to stick with us, but it's not. The Hispanic population is exactly that. I've mentioned this in other podcasts. We have to be careful, though, about the conclusions that we're drawing from the data. Now, what the elites got wrong in this election cycle, I talked about this in kind of a part one. Let's talk about what's happening in the demography of the country in part two here. The economy, demography, and political opinions are not settled. In other words, they're unsettled. So while we used to be able to predict a wave election or large numbers of people, they're not happening in that direction anymore. So we have to be especially cautious. There are Leviathan forces still moving in the deep that we're ignoring because we don't want to see them realistically, either side of the aisle. And I want to just kind of bring a couple of these up. There is a demographer's dilemma in which we assume that numbers are reliable, but they don't necessarily mean the same things that they used to. And I think of this as Jonah's perspective. Now, everybody knows about Jonah and the whale, but we don't know what happened so much after Jonah washed up on the shore as he looked at Nineveh and cursed it, hoping that somehow it would go up in godly wrath. It didn't happen. And some people are assuming that's obviously what's going to happen. Jonah's curses are going to come true because I just don't like those people. Whether you like people or not, it is a difficult thing to predict the future. So the obvious example is the Hispanic vote tended to go conservative, not liberal, and certainly not the numbers that it used to. And even in the African American community, with intermarriage and people moving to different parts of the nation, it is not what it used to be. So Jonah was wrong in cursing these people, partly because I think he didn't understand the people that he was trying to curse. Now, I'm going to give you an example of some demographics that we're seeing that are kind of monumental, and you ought to know. One is birth rates. There are some parts of the country that are doing just fine with the number of babies being born. But there are other parts of the nation that are really looking at very hard times. The Bay Area in California is a good example of it. They're not having children. The school systems are suffering a big decline in the population. We also know that the birth rates among some groups are much different than they are in others. And race and ethnicity are not really the primary indicators of who's having babies and who's not. So when Roe versus Wade came on the scene, the Supreme Court gave it back to the states to overturn it or not. And it turns out that a lot of people are happy with abortion rights and others are not. And it's difficult to predict who it is that is following this trend. But birth rates are going to become increasingly important in the next 5 years. We need more babies being born to support the economy and to help practices sustain themselves. Now, the job market's another thing that's happening. We were sort of assuming before the pandemic that the job market was just fine. It turns out it was a little bit early to make that kind of prediction. There are some parts of the job market, the blue-collar workers particularly, who are making much more money than they did before, are heavily involved in unions, and they're not so crazy about what they've seen, even though the natural constituency for the union membership is the Democrat Party. But in the places that the unions are strong, they're not necessarily going the way you'd think they'd go. The other thing is the housing market. There has been a movement to almost destroy any new housing that's being built. Now, this is not just in one state or two states. It's based on what we're seeing in several states or several parts of states in which you cannot buy a home. Young people are being priced out of the market, and that's having an effect on practices. Do I think healthcare is doomed? I don't believe that at all. But I do think that it is unwise to make broad predictions about where the housing market is going. Rates have soared, but the price of housing has moderated in some states, not in others. So we're looking not just about availability of housing, but the type of housing that we find there and the price of housing. And this is having a big impact upon the future of the economies in the various states. Consumer debt is an issue which is not really on the headlines as much as I think it should be. But there are a lot of people who owe big money on credit cards, and they're going to be suffering because of it. So ultimately, consumer debt may all of a sudden become a major wag the dog kind of situation. We have a lot of people who are in such terrible debt that they can't afford the health care that they acknowledge that they need. And therefore, the consumer debt is going to become more important for doctors to track than ever before. We're also seeing mortgage rates, which have doubled essentially in about 2 or 3 years. It means that young people are being priced out of the market in some places, and elderly people, people like me, are fine with it. They're happy because they've already got a fixed rate mortgage. It's those who have variable rate mortgages that are trying to figure something creative out, and it's being pretty bad. Foreign conflicts, world wars, in other words, are still occurring. Now, whether it's Ukraine or Russia that are fighting, or nations in Asia that are going to fight or may be fighting, these conflicts are going to be becoming more and more important to the United States population, particularly on the coasts where they tend to be more immigrant, have an other nation of origin. And this can be a big deal. We know that there is going to be a major conflict in South and Central America. We don't talk about it because we're always fixated on what's happening in Europe or in Asia. But I believe that we're going to see some very serious foreign conflicts, and it is going to affect the Americas because our immigrant class are primarily Hispanic. There is an unchecked flow of non-citizens, and you all know it. You watch the news. You can see that large numbers, millions of people are crossing the border. The problem is it's not just a matter of, natives, white people who are having a problem with this. Hispanic populations are almost having a civil war themselves to keep their compatriots out. And because these are the people who are grabbing blue-collar, low-skilled jobs. And that is making those people much testier in urban areas than what we are told about in the news. There is an energy market problem that we're facing. And again, the Biden administration believes that renewables are just fine. Unfortunately, it's not. And as I've looked at the statistics and what other demographers are telling me from their reports, we're seeing that including the transportation of that energy market, getting oil and gas from one place to another, is becoming a serious issue. There are some states that have said they're simply not going to allow the funding of the energy market, exploration and refining. And this is an issue that for some reason a lot of people are ignoring, but it can't be ignored forever, especially as the weather gets colder. There is a crime rate problem, as you well know. We see people who are in some parts of the United States that are having a major crime spree. And it looks like politicians have not decided to say, well, we've got to fight crime. We all know it's going to happen, or that it should happen. But while they want to put this off for a political benefit, I think we're going to see some major problems get much worse. The rail strike and the diesel shortage are happening right now. We don't know, but the rail strike may actually be halted for a while, but that only puts the problem off for later, not long term. And one would assume that the president, who claims to be a major supporter of the unions, would be right at their side. But people are not supporting him and them in ways that they had before. We also have a diesel shortage, and this is keeping transportation from happening. It may encourage increased crime. Now, this is what demographers are talking about right now, but I don't think it's getting the attention that it needs, and so I figured, what the heck, I'd let you know what they're talking about. Now, a lot of people will say, all right, where should I put a practice? Where will we be protected from the terrible things that are likely on the horizon, like I showed on the previous slides? Well, there are some factors that I want you to be aware of to find locations that are going to be more stable and safer for practices to form and to continue profitably. These are the safe districts, in other words. One is the owner-occupied homes, the dwellings, when you find a large percentage of the population are living in properties that they own, not rent, or even lease, they're in a better position. So the occupancy rate is becoming especially important now, even more than it did just 5 years ago. There is not an easy slush fund of housing units that we can find to move these people into. So the prices on housing are likely going to increase in the spring. The proximity of housing and work, in other words, employment, when you live and work relatively close together, as they do more in the suburbs, that's a very good condition for people. So a lot of people are finding their work and their housing, the best situation is where they're close together. And part of this is due to the fact that the energy market is punishing people with long commutes. It used to be not such a big deal, but now the price of gasoline has tripled, and it is projected by my friends, the demographers, that this is going to kind of make a brand new market, and it may not be helpful. Growth and variety and density of their population is also important. It isn't enough to have a Del Webb community where people can just get together because of their age and they're all wealthy. We need a variety of places, and they almost have to happen in a much closer proximity than they used to. Now, growth is necessary, but also variety and diversity of the population and their lifestyles is becoming important for healthcare practices. Now, it's true that gerontology or geriatric medicine was growing. It was a very big deal. But there is a demand for younger families to find a place to live and to work. And this is going to become a primary issue that no one's talking about. So, in other words, these are the kinds of places that practices will be protected as they set up. And what I want you to look for are places that will meet these criteria. Access to water and energy is kind of a new thing. We've always assumed that people can get water and energy anyplace, but there are some parts of the country that are being starved of energy and water, and it's going to hurt the United States. There are dam projects that produce electricity that are being closed, and I assume it's because the federal government doesn't like them, doesn't find them profitable, won't allow for a green energy deal. But people want it. So if you find that there's a place that you can get water and energy relatively close to where you live, which is also producing a lot more growth, that's a much better situation for you. Now, access to transportation, I mean surface roads, is very important because a lot of freeways are not being upgraded. They've got 2 lanes of traffic and they're sort of assuming, doggone it, we're going to be happy with that. Well, what we're seeing during the holiday season is there are a lot of people who are saying, I can't get there where I want to go easily anymore. I cannot commute in a reasonable period of time. That's what they're saying about that. So this is an issue that I think we're going to have to face increasingly. Now, let me predict the future. Reading the tea leaves is one of the things I do. City politics, from what my demographer friends are saying, is going to change. Machine politics is likely to die. There was a time in which big cities that had a large unionized urban character like Chicago and St. Louis, New York City. Now, I read the tea leaves in predicting the future, and one of the things we're seeing is that city politics are going to change. There was a time in which people were more homogeneous in the large metropolitan areas. And because of this, these people in a machine politics area were not growing. In fact, if we look at the biggest loss of population, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, these are places that have a big city politics contingent, but it looks like they are not going to continue as they have been. And in fact, as people become more discouraged with what they've seen, they're leaving town. And this is going to have an effect upon practices where they go. We have another thing, it's an interesting criteria called wandering feet. It will rise. Now, wandering feet means the people moved. They often did it by foot, or like the Okies had an old truck that they would run around with. And that was mainly in the 30s and 40s. We haven't seen the number of people leaving town in these numbers as we have before. So this means, in other words, our population is much more mobile than it ever has been before. Core industries are changing their geographics. So it used to be that there were some cities that were major manufacturing centers, but manufacturing has changed. Supply chain hubs will recenter themselves. So if we look at places with lots of heavy industry, they're not as heavy as they used to be. There are only so many Detroits in the United States that we really need. So they're downsizing or importing their heavy industry power within the industries in their states. Racial and ethnic loyalties will surprise some people. Old friends and new enemies will emerge. And this is a bit of a challenge to the traditional liberal constituencies. There are a lot of people who do not want to belong to a union, and so they're trying to get out of them right now. We always assumed that certain races and ethnic groups were going to be decidedly blue collar, and they were going to do great. But you see, that math is changing. Now, last thing is healthcare is going to downsize. New networks will reform themselves. Now, I'm getting this because I have a son who's getting his graduate degree in hospital administration, and he's let me in on a lot of interesting things. Many of the networks are defined by their state boundaries because that's what the regulators were in, but that is changing. State lines are not as firm as they once were or are likely to be. So we are going to see a kind of a revolution within healthcare, hospital administration included, as well as large groups. Just keep your eye on that space. If you would like more, please call us at 800-849-0499. Dr. Demographics does reports on specific locations and can examine trends that are going to be important to you and your practice type. Our job is to give you good information quickly and at a reasonable price. So if we can help you out, please visit us at drdemographics.com. I am Scott McDonald, and thanks so much for watching.